The 1950s are remembered for style and optimism, but not every vehicle from that decade deserves nostalgia. Some early SUVs were crude, uncomfortable, badly engineered, and sometimes downright dangerous. They rattled, broke, overheated, and handled like farm tractors on the highway, yet they were sold as the future of family adventure. Here are the 10 worst SUVs of the 1950s, and you won't believe these things were actually real.
The Willys Jeep station wagon is one of those vehicles that sounds wonderful in brochures and in nostalgic stories, but when you look past the charm and the wood panel styling cues, you find something that was closer to a farm implement than a family car. It was born directly out of the Jeep military DNA of World War II, and almost nothing about it was softened for civilian life. That was both its greatest virtue and its greatest curse. Families in the late 1940s saw the ads showing smiling kids, luggage piled to the roof, and the promise of adventure. What they often got instead was noise, vibration, and a kind of fatigue you normally associate with riding in the back of an army truck. The construction was essentially a box bolted onto a ladder frame that had been designed for off-road work, not comfort. The body panels were thin and they drummed constantly at speed, so the entire cabin seemed to buzz like a giant metal hive. Wind whistled through door gaps because sealing was almost an afterthought. There was almost no real insulation, so you heard everything: the whine of the gears, the groaning of the drivetrain, gravel pinging the floor, and the engine working itself to death up front. Long trips turned into long conversations about how much longer you could stand the noise. The suspension was pure Jeep thinking, leaf springs front and rear, built to handle ruts, rocks, and military abuse, not children in the back seat complaining about being bounced into the roof. On paved roads, the wagon never stopped moving. It bobbed, pitched, and bounded over every irregularity. Drivers often said it felt like piloting a small boat in constant chop. If you hit railroad tracks at any speed, the whole vehicle would shudder like it had been struck with a hammer. Steering added to the drama. It was vague, slow, and heavy, with so much play in the wheel that you were constantly correcting, never quite sure where straight ahead really was. At higher speeds, it could feel almost detached from your intentions. Comfort was nearly non-existent by modern standards. The seats were upright metal frames with thin padding stretched over them, as if copied directly from a bus station bench. Long rides meant sore backs and numb legs, and if you were unlucky enough to sit in the rear, the bouncing was even worse. Heating was weak, ventilation was crude, and in winter, the interior could feel like a tin can with a cold draft poured through it. Families expecting something like a Buick wagon were in for a rude awakening. Performance was another problem. Early versions used the little Go Devil 4-cylinder engine, designed originally for wartime service, not interstate travel. It was durable, yes, but painfully slow. Loaded with people and luggage, the wagon wheezed up hills in a cloud of mechanical protest, with drivers often downshifting and praying for patience from the traffic behind them. Highway speeds were theoretically possible, but completely miserable. Every vibration, every wobble, every engine noise multiplied as you pushed it harder. Owners joked that the wagon vibrated so much at 55 miles per hour that it practically shook the change out of your pockets. Handling expectations had to be completely reset. The tall, narrow stance and high center of gravity meant body roll was dramatic, even in mild corners. Quick lane changes were not recommended unless you also enjoyed adrenaline and prayer. Calling it truck-like is actually generous. Many drivers said it felt more like a road-legal tractor wearing a wagon body. It would plow straight ahead if pushed too hard, the front end washing wide while the rear bounced and skipped over bumps. On dirt roads, it felt at home, but on pavement, especially wet pavement, it demanded a level of respect that few family wagons ever required. And yet, despite all of this, it had character. Owners remembered it the way you remember a difficult but honest friend. It was simple, tough, and willing. It would get you down muddy roads that normal cars would never attempt. Farmers loved it, hunters loved it, rural doctors loved it because it would go anywhere. But suburban families moving out of soft-riding sedans were often shocked. Many first owners learned quickly that it was not a comfortable family wagon disguised as a Jeep. It was a Jeep reluctantly disguised as a family wagon. One owner summed it up in the 1950s with a mix of affection and frustration. It will take you anywhere on Earth, and it will punish you every mile of the way. That line captures the Willys Jeep station wagon perfectly. It was pioneering, important, and incredibly influential as one of the earliest ancestors of the SUV. But if you drove one daily, you also discovered the harsh truth that progress in comfort and refinement had not yet arrived. It rattled your teeth, it shook your bones, it shouted every sound into the cabin, and after a few hours behind the wheel, you understood exactly why later wagons moved far away from their military roots.
The 1953 International Harvester Travelall is one of those vehicles that reminds you exactly who built it. Not Ford, not Chevrolet, not a company thinking about chrome, comfort, and dealership brochures, but a company whose main business was tractors, farm equipment, and work trucks. International Harvester understood durability, loads, and fields. What they did not fully understand yet was the idea of a quiet, civilized family wagon. So when they essentially took a heavy-duty truck chassis, added windows and extra seats, and called it a Travelall, the result was something fascinating, honest, and brutally demanding to live with. On paper, the Travelall looked ahead of its time. A large enclosed wagon body, 3 rows of seating, enormous cargo space. The idea was haul the family during the week, haul supplies or tow equipment on weekends. In many ways, it was the spiritual grandfather of the Suburban and modern SUVs. But once you climbed into one and drove it, any illusion that it was meant to be comfortable disappeared within minutes. The steering was the first shock. There was no power assist because in International's mind, drivers of work trucks didn't need luxury, they needed strength. The steering box and front suspension were built to handle heavy loads and rough roads, which meant that at low speeds, the wheel felt like you were turning the rudder of a ship. Parking lots, tight turns, and city streets became workouts for your arms and shoulders. Even at speed, the wheel never really relaxed. You held on, constantly making small corrections, because the solid front axle and old-school suspension transmitted every rut, groove, and crosswind directly into the steering column. The brakes added their own layer of anxiety. Drums on all 4 corners, tuned for trucks but not necessarily for repeated downhill braking. On long grades, especially with passengers or cargo, the pedal would slowly feel softer, longer, and less reassuring. Drivers learned to downshift, plan far ahead, and leave generous space, because once the brakes heated up, stopping distances expanded dramatically. Stories from owners describe sweaty palms, white knuckles, and a quiet prayer descending mountain roads. Noise was a constant companion. The cabin was a giant metal shell with little insulation. It carried sound the same way a drum carries vibration. The inline engine up front clattered and roared. The transmission whined. The differential howled at speed, and the body panels resonated. At highway speeds, conversation became shouting. Every loose bolt, every rattle, every panel buzz joined the orchestra. Nothing was subtle. Everything was mechanical, raw, and unapologetically loud. Fuel consumption was equally unforgiving. These were heavy vehicles with big, slow-revving engines designed for torque rather than efficiency. Owners joked that you could watch the fuel gauge move if you drove with a heavy foot. Around town, it drank gasoline like a thirsty tractor. On the highway, it barely improved. In an era when families were beginning to appreciate fuel economy, the Travelall felt like operating a small commercial vehicle. Filling it up was always an event. Then there was rust, the enemy that arrived early and stayed forever. Many Travelalls lived on farms, gravel roads, salted winter highways, or near moisture. International's body protection simply wasn't as refined or thorough as car makers specializing in passenger vehicles. Wheel arches, rocker panels, lower doors, and tailgates often started bubbling and flaking within just a few years. You could almost see the future through some of the panels if you waited long enough. For collectors today, finding one that isn't dissolving is almost miraculous. Comfort was hardly part of the equation. The seats were basic, functional, more like something you'd expect in a work truck. The ride was stiff and choppy. Leaf springs meant every pothole was sent directly through the frame and into your spine. If you drove long distances, you didn't arrive, you survived. Heat and ventilation were primitive. Air conditioning was a fantasy. Passengers often described traveling in the travelall as being transported, not riding. And yet, there was something undeniably admirable about it. It was tough. It could tow, haul, carry, and work day after day without complaining, as long as you could put up with the punishment. Farmers, ranchers, electricians, utility companies, and rural families appreciated its honesty. It didn't pretend to be glamorous. It didn't flatter you. It simply did the job, no matter how hard. One owner famously summed up the experience in a single sentence that still fits perfectly today. It felt like the truck was always fighting me, and somehow I respected it for that. That's the 1953 International Harvester Travelall. In a nutshell, ahead of its time in concept, decades behind in comfort, built like farm equipment, loud, demanding, brutal, and strangely unforgettable. If modern SUVs are plush living rooms on wheels, the early Travelall was a steel barn on wheels, stubbornly reminding you that work always came first.
The early 1950s Chevrolet Suburban is one of those vehicles that proves just how far the idea of family transportation has evolved. Today, the Suburban is associated with quiet highway cruising, air-conditioned comfort, smooth automatic transmissions, and near-luxury interiors. But its early 1950s ancestors were something completely different. They were closer to work trucks with extra seats than anything resembling a modern SUV. They were tough, durable, capable of hauling huge loads, and at the same time loud, primitive, exhausting, and often genuinely uncomfortable to live with. Climb into an early 50s Suburban, and the first thing you notice is how bare everything feels. There is sheet metal everywhere, very little insulation. Interior panels are thin, the floor is steel. Every vibration from the engine, every pebble under the tires, every movement of the drive shaft is transmitted directly into the cabin. When it rains, you can actually hear the drumming on the roof amplified through the body like a giant tin can. At idle, the straight six under the hood has that slow agricultural thrum, charming at first, but tiring after hours of hearing it reverberate through the uninsulated interior. Steering is another reminder that you're driving a truck from a different era. There is enormous play in the wheel. You can turn it several inches before anything meaningful happens at the front tires. At speed, you are constantly correcting, sawing the wheel back and forth just to keep the thing in a lane. On rutted roads, the front end wanders and follows grooves, dragging the steering with it. Drivers quickly learned that relaxed highway cruising simply did not exist. You were always working. After a full day behind the wheel, arms and shoulders would ache like you had been rowing a boat against a current. The brakes were all drums, and while they were acceptable around town, they faded badly under repeated use. Long downhill grades were especially nerve-wracking. Hit the pedal a few times, and it gradually sank closer to the floor, requiring more pressure and delivering less stopping force. Drivers learned to plan far ahead, shift down, and leave huge following distances, because an early 50s Suburban with passengers and cargo does not stop quickly. Many owners joked that the best braking system was anticipation. Ride quality may be the most unforgettable part of the experience. These Suburbans used stiff leaf springs designed to carry heavy loads, not to pamper passengers. On an empty vehicle, the result is brutal. Hit a railroad crossing or a sudden dip, and the entire body bucks like a mechanical bull. Rear passengers especially were often launched upward hard enough to actually hit the roof bows. Children who grew up riding in them remember being lifted off the seats on country roads and landing laughing or crying, depending on the bump. The suspension was strong, yes, but forgiving? Not at all. Climate control was almost a joke. In winter, the heater struggled to push enough warm air to the back of the long cabin. People wrapped themselves in blankets and scraped frost from the inside of the glass. In summer, ventilation relied mainly on wing windows, sliding glass, and hope.
With the big engine radiating heat into the uninsulated firewall, cabins became rolling ovens. Long trips and hot weather left passengers drenched in sweat, clothes sticking to the vinyl seats. Despite all this, the Suburban had a rugged charm. It could tow, it could haul, it could carry 8 or 9 people and all their luggage, when many cars could barely manage 4 comfortably. Rural families, ranchers, construction crews, and small-town fire departments relied on them. They started in the cold, slogged through mud, climbed dirt roads, and shrugged off abuse that would have destroyed lighter cars of the era. They were tools first, and transportation second. Owners from the period often described the experience with a mix of frustration and affection. One summed it up perfectly. It would get you anywhere, but it made sure you earned every mile. That is the early 1950s Chevrolet Suburban in spirit. Not yet the polished American icon it would become, but a loud, hot, cold, rattling, bone-shaking workhorse that built the reputation the modern Suburban now enjoys. It was not comfortable, it was not relaxing, it was not gentle with passengers, but it was incredibly tough, incredibly capable, and absolutely honest about what it was, a truck with seats, pushing through America's roads long before the word SUV ever existed.
The Dodge Power Wagon Carryall is one of those machines that makes you respect it before you even think about driving it. It was born directly from war, not inspired by, not based loosely on, but practically lifted from military battlefields and given seats and doors so civilians could buy it. And when you drive one, you feel that heritage every single second. It is tough, unstoppable, heroic in its capability, and at the same time exhausting, noisy, brutally slow, and stubborn in a way that feels almost alive. Open the heavy metal door and climb in, and I really do mean climb. The floor sits high, the step is awkward, and you grab the steering wheel just to pull yourself aboard. Inside, there is almost nothing that resembles comfort. The seats are simple pads over steel frames. The interior is bare metal, painted and utilitarian. The smell is a mixture of old oil, gear grease, dust, and time itself. Everything is functional, nothing is decorative, and everything feels overbuilt, as if designed to survive a bomb blast. Start the engine and the whole body shudders. The old straight six doesn't purr, it rumbles, shakes, coughs, and finally settles into a heavy industrial idle. You don't forget that this was designed to haul soldiers, weapons, tools, and tow equipment through mud, snow, jungle, and war zones. The Power Wagon Carryall sounds less like a car and more like a small tractor waking up reluctantly at dawn. Then comes the real challenge, moving it. The transmission is unsynchronized, meaning shifting requires timing, patience, and skill most modern drivers simply don't have. Double clutching becomes a ritual. Get the rhythm wrong and the gears grind loudly, like metal screaming at you. The shifter itself feels long and agricultural, like a lever pulled from a piece of farm machinery. Every change of gear reminds you that this truck does not care about your comfort, only about durability. The clutch is heavy enough to count as a workout. You don't press it, you push against it, using your thigh like a piston. After an hour of city driving, drivers used to joke that their left leg looked like it belonged to a professional cyclist. Farmers complained about it, ranchers complained about it. Even soldiers who drove the wartime versions admitted it was punishing. And yet, once you finally get rolling, another enemy appears, the ride. The suspension is pure utility, stiff leaf springs, reinforced for payloads, not passengers. On dirt or rocky terrain, it feels controlled and stable because that's what it was born for. But on normal paved roads, especially when unloaded, it is merciless. Every pothole, every crack, every expansion joint sends a sharp jolt through the frame and directly into your spine. The body rattles, the windows buzz, the dashboard trembles. Long trips feel like hour-long arguments between your bones and the truck. Speed? Forget it.
On paper, the truck can technically reach highway speeds. In reality, anything above 45 miles per hour feels like a negotiation with physics, and physics is winning. The steering wanders, the tires hum loudly, wind noise blasts through every gap in the body, and the engine howls with desperation. Drivers described it as feeling like the entire vehicle was holding together through sheer determination. And brakes? Well, you learn patience. Drum brakes and a heavy chassis mean stopping distances feel measured in football fields when fully loaded. You plan ahead, slow early, and hope nothing unexpected happens in front of you. But despite all of this, the Dodge Power Wagon Carryall earned its legend honestly. Point it toward rough country, muddy logging trails, rocky mountainsides, snow-packed rural roads, washed-out farm tracks, and suddenly the truck transforms. Low-range gearing, solid axles, and sheer brute strength make obstacles disappear. It doesn't rush, it crawls forward steadily, slowly, confidently, like something built to outlast the world. Hunters, ranchers, miners, surveyors, and early off-road enthusiasts trusted it because it simply refused to quit. Many owners summed up the experience in a single sentence: it would beat you up, but it would never let you down. That contradiction is what defines the Dodge Power Wagon Carryall. Legendary durability, absolute off-road dominance, a rolling monument to wartime engineering, and at the same time, loud, slow, uncomfortable, stubborn, and physically demanding in a way most drivers today cannot imagine. It was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to survive, to work, and to conquer terrain where normal vehicles wouldn't dare go. And in that sense, it did its job better than almost anything of its era, even if it left its drivers sore, tired, and sometimes questioning their life choices by the end of the day. The Land Rover Series 1 is one of those vehicles that modern nostalgia has turned into something almost mythical. Today, we see restored examples in glossy magazines, parked in front of mountain cabins, wearing roof racks and leather straps, looking elegant and adventurous. We imagine quiet safaris, slow, scenic drives, explorers smiling under the sun. But if you step back into the late 1940s and 1950s and actually sit inside one as it truly was, the romance disappears very quickly. What you discover instead is a machine that feels more like agricultural equipment disguised as transportation. Brave, brilliant, historically important? Absolutely. Comfortable? Civilized? Relaxing? Not even close. You didn't so much enter a Series 1 as climb into it. The doors were thin, almost tin-like, and when you shut them, they rarely sealed with confidence. They rattled constantly, buzzing against the frame, letting dust, water, and cold air pour in through obvious gaps. When it rained, water didn't politely drip outside. It sneaked in, found seams, and would run down onto your feet or across the floor. Inside, the interior looked more like a workshop than a car. Exposed bolts, bare metal panels, flat surfaces, and simple painted dashboards. Everything was designed with military or farm use in mind. You could wash the interior with a hose if you wanted. Comfort was something you provided yourself, usually in the form of warm clothing and patience. And those seats, thin vinyl pads on rigid metal frames, no contouring, no cushioning, just a square pad and a backrest that felt more like an afterthought. After 2 hours of driving, your back and hips would feel like you'd been sitting on a folding chair bouncing across a gravel field. Drivers joked that long trips in a Land Rover were cheaper than a chiropractor because the Rover rearranged your spine for free. Then the driving experience itself. The steering was legendary for all the wrong reasons. Wander was the word everyone used. You didn't point the Land Rover straight and relax. You constantly corrected. Left, right, left again. It was a slow, vague conversation between you and the front axle, and the axle always seemed slightly drunk. On narrow roads, you never really stopped paying attention because the Rover wouldn't let you. The gearbox demanded effort and sympathy. Shifts were slow and deliberate. Try rushing it, and you were rewarded with grouching metal noises. Low-range gears for off-road use worked beautifully, but on normal streets, everything felt geared for farm lanes, not highways. And overheating? Absolutely real. Push the little engine too hard, especially on hot days or long climbs, and the temperature gauge would creep upward like a guilty secret. Owners became experts in roadside cooling rituals, stopping, waiting, opening the hood, letting steam sigh quietly into the air. Many carried extra water. Everyone carried patience. Ride quality was another unforgettable chapter. Leaf springs over solid axles meant the suspension was built for strength, not comfort. On dirt, mud, or jungle tracks, that rugged design worked perfectly. But the moment you hit normal paved roads, every imperfection came straight through the frame. Hit a pothole, and it felt like the seat tried to launch you upward. Drive across rough washboard roads, and your teeth chattered, your hands buzzed numb around the wheel, and the entire vehicle vibrated as if it was shaking itself apart. Noise filled everything. Gear whine, engine roar, wind howling through gaps, panels vibrating. Even at moderate speeds, the Series 1 sounded like it was having an argument with physics. And yet, the paradox appears. Take that same uncomfortable, rattling, noisy box into the jungle, across muddy farmland, through rivers, over rocky trails, and suddenly it feels unstoppable. Low gear engaged, engine humming, wheels finding traction where normal cars would surrender. Farmers loved it. Soldiers trusted it. Doctors in remote villages relied on it. Missionaries, explorers, survey teams, and adventurers drove them to places barely shown on maps. It crawled rather than raced. It worked rather than entertained, and it did so with almost stubborn determination. Owners summed up the Land Rover Series 1 like this: it would get you there, it just wouldn't care how comfortable you were when you arrived. That is its true character. A brilliant tool, a harsh teacher, a machine built from necessity, steel, aluminum, and simple mechanics, not comfort, luxury, or convenience. Romantic today, yes. Historic, yes. Iconic, undeniably. But in its own era, the Land Rover Series 1 was closer to an aluminum box with wheels, noise, vibration, leaks, and pain. A hero off-road, and a punishment in everyday life. And maybe that is exactly why it became legendary. It was honest, uncompromising, and built to survive a world that was still rough, muddy, remote, and unpaved.
The GAZ69 is one of those vehicles that looks simple, honest, and almost charming at first glance, until you actually live with it. Then the charm turns into something closer to endurance training. It was never designed to be pleasant. It was designed to move soldiers, equipment, officers, and unlucky passengers across mud, snow, fields, and roads that barely counted as roads. In that mission, it succeeded brilliantly. In every other sense, it was stubborn, crude, and punishing. Step up to one and you immediately understand the priorities. Flat panels, exposed hinges, no frills anywhere. Every line exists because it needed to be stamped cheaply and repaired easily. Replacing a fender was more like changing a shovel blade than working on a car. You grabbed tools, unbolted metal, bolted new metal on, and kept driving. The Soviet engineers approached it like farm machinery, simple, rugged, understandable even by someone with basic mechanical knowledge and a hammer. Then you climb inside. The canvas top is the first thing most owners remember. In theory, it protected you from weather. In practice, it fluttered, snapped, buzzed, and flapped like a tent in a hurricane. On windy roads, it made a constant drumming sound, vibrating overhead while seams squeaked and ropes strained. When rain came, the water found its way inside. When winter arrived, cold simply blew through gaps as if the car was politely reminding you that Siberia exists. Seats? Calling them seats is generous. Thin pads stretched over frames, straight backs, no support.
After an hour, your lower back protested. After 2 hours, your legs felt numb. Drivers often joked that long trips in the GAZ-69 were like military discipline. You did not complain, you endured. And the suspension, leaf springs front and rear, stiff as iron. On rough trails, it did what it was meant to do. It survived. But on regular roads, every rut sent the entire body into a rhythmic rolling bounce. It felt like being on a fishing boat in bad weather. Hit a series of bumps, and the truck would oscillate, up, down, up again, passengers swaying back and forth while grabbing anything bolted down. People who rode in the back sometimes came out pale and quiet, as if they had survived something emotional. Dust was another constant enemy. In summer, with the canvas sides rolled up or the windows half open, clouds of dirt swept through the cabin. Everything inside acquired a gritty coating: dashboard, clothes, hair, teeth. You learned to live with it. You also learned to carry rags, and probably cigarettes, because nearly everyone smoked inside these things, to mask the smells of fuel, oil, and hot metal. Heating barely deserved the name. A small heater existed, yes, but winter in most Soviet regions laughed at it. Drivers wore coats, hats, gloves, sometimes even blankets. The engine warmed slowly, the air inside stayed cold, and breath condensed on glass. You wiped the windshield constantly. Frost lived inside the car as much as outside. Driving required physical effort. The steering was heavy. Slow maneuvers demanded strength. The clutch was firm. The gearbox wanted deliberate movement, not quick shifts. Everything about the GAZ-69 reminded you that machines did not exist to serve comfort. They existed to work. And if you stalled in deep mud or snow, the engine's low power meant you coaxed it forward like a stubborn animal, feathering throttle, listening to the wheezy sound as it struggled back to life. Reliability was a strange story. Some examples ran forever, patched together endlessly, crossing fields, rivers, villages, mountains. Others broke constantly, depending on who assembled them, what parts were available, and how they were maintained. Mechanics carried spares, wire, rope, and ingenuity. If something failed on the road, the unofficial rule was, fix it where it sits, bend metal, retie, weld if possible, continue. But then comes the part that explains why it lasted so long and earned respect despite all the misery. Off-road, the GAZ-69 was relentless. With simple four-wheel drive, tough axles, and low gears, it crawled through sludge where more sophisticated vehicles sank. It crossed rivers up to the doors, climbed steep, rutted tracks, pulled carts, hauled soldiers and cargo, delivered supplies to remote villages. It became the workhorse of armies, border posts, farms, doctors, geologists, hunters, and anyone who lived beyond paved civilization. It did not care about comfort. It cared about survival. Owners and drivers often summed it up in short, dry sentences. It goes anywhere. It just makes you suffer on the way. And that truly defines the GAZ-69. Not elegant, not refined, not something you'd choose for a pleasant Sunday drive, but in harsh climates, poor roads, and desperate conditions, it was loyal, fixable, stubborn, and incredibly tough. A machine that belonged to a different era, one where endurance mattered more than convenience, and where vehicles were judged not by how they felt, but whether they got you home alive.
The Toyota Land Cruiser BJ of 1951 was an extraordinary machine for its time, a vehicle designed for function over comfort, endurance over luxury, and rugged terrain over smooth pavement. Its genesis came directly from Toyota's study of the Willys Jeep during the late 1940s, and while it borrowed the Jeep's basic layout, Toyota's engineers sought to make something stronger, more durable, and capable of surviving Japan's mountainous regions and rural roads. What they produced was a workhorse of unmatched reliability, but it demanded respect, patience, and significant physical effort from anyone behind the wheel. Clutch operation was famously brutal.
Fully pressing it required the strength of a grown man, and even then the pedal had a harsh bite that could jar your leg muscles if you weren't prepared. Early drivers quickly learned that starting on inclines was a test of coordination, strength, and endurance. Stalling meant either rolling backward into rocks or forcing the driver to hop out and assist the vehicle manually. Coupled with the primitive gearbox, gear changes required a deliberate and almost ritualistic sequence: lift, shift, match revs, release, a dance that anyone accustomed to modern light clutches would find exhausting. Steering was another ordeal. Without power assistance, the front wheels felt as if welded to the terrain. Turning at low speeds demanded full-arm effort, muscles straining with every twist of the wheel. Tight hairpins on mountain trails became mini workouts. On longer stretches of road, the steering feedback was relentless. Small corrections required continuous tension, leaving forearms sore after hours of driving. The cabin environment did little to ease the strain. Noise from the engine, gearbox, and chassis was deafening. Every gear change, every shift in torque, every minor imperfection in the road reverberated through the metal body and into the driver's ears. The vibration from the rigid frame and simple suspension added to the sensory assault. There were no insulation panels, no soundproofing, and little thought to ergonomics. Seats were basic slabs of metal with thin padding, offering barely any support over rough terrain. Heat management was primitive. In summer, the cramped cabin became a stifling oven as engine heat radiated through the floor, while winter provided little relief from the cold that seeped through the thin steel panels and canvas elements. Rainwater could leak in through door gaps, seals, and the removable canvas roof, turning the interior into a damp, uncomfortable environment. Long trips required careful clothing choices and the acceptance of perpetual discomfort. Yet, despite all this, the Land Cruiser BJ performed spectacularly in the conditions it was designed for. Mountains, rivers, mud, and poorly maintained rural roads were no match for it. The 3.4-liter inline-six, modest by modern standards, delivered torque reliably, powering the vehicle where lesser machines would stall. Its rigid ladder frame, live axles, and simple but robust suspension soaked up punishment that would cripple civilian cars. Even when driven aggressively over rocks or deep mud, it rarely failed, earning the grudging admiration of military units, farmers, foresters, and explorers alike. Drivers quickly learned the paradox of the BJ. It was punishing to operate, but unrelenting in performance. Every journey demanded concentration, strength, and patience, and the reward was a vehicle that rarely broke down, could traverse places no ordinary car could, and carried loads, people, equipment, and supplies to destinations that were otherwise unreachable. The Land Cruiser BJ became legendary not because it was comfortable or fast, but because it was nearly indestructible. Early owners would tell stories of journeys that left them exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally, yet grateful to have a vehicle that refused to fail when it mattered most. Mountains were conquered, rivers were forded, and communities in remote areas gained access to transportation that was reliable, even if it was brutal. In the end, the BJ was more than a vehicle. It was a teacher. It taught endurance, patience, and respect for machinery. Comfort was sacrificed for utility, but in return, the Land Cruiser earned a reputation that continues to echo through every modern iteration, a lineage built on strength, resilience, and a refusal to give up, no matter how punishing the journey might be.
The Willys Jeep CJ3B, introduced in 1953, was designed as a civilian evolution of the rugged military Jeep that had dominated the battlefields just a few years earlier. It promised the same indestructible off-road capabilities that soldiers had relied upon, but for farmers, families, and adventurers. At first glance, it seemed ideal, a compact, simple, mechanically honest vehicle that could tackle terrain that no ordinary car could touch. But as soon as it was put into daily civilian use, its harsh realities became painfully clear. The CJ3B was uncompromising, almost merciless in its demands of the driver and passengers, and it revealed the stark divide between a machine built for survival and one built for comfort. Its short wheelbase, perfect for tight trails and climbing obstacles, became a liability on pavement. Every bump, pothole, or dip in the road translated into violent jolts through the rigid frame. Passengers were tossed up and down with each irregularity, often banging heads, elbows, or knees against the thin metal frames of the seats. The minimal padding and almost non-existent suspension travel meant that long journeys were physically exhausting. A half-hour drive could leave a family sore, bruised, and rattled. The canvas top, while offering some protection from sun and rain, flapped violently in the wind, creating a continuous roar that made conversation difficult. Windows let in gusts of wind, dust, and debris, further assaulting the senses. Even in fair weather, the cabin was loud, cold in winter, and unbearably hot in summer. The CJ3B demanded attention, endurance, and tolerance for discomfort at all times. Steering was another ordeal. Without power assistance, low-speed maneuvers required raw strength, while at higher speeds, the Jeep's light front axle could wander unpredictably. Sudden steering corrections on uneven roads were a gamble. The vehicle could dart, lurch, or even tip slightly if the turn was sharp enough. Combined with the tall hood and limited forward visibility, everyday driving became a tense exercise in constant vigilance. Parking, navigating intersections, and merging into traffic were physically and mentally exhausting tasks. Drivers often reported a persistent feeling of imbalance, as though the Jeep was always ready to slide, tip, or bounce in directions they didn't intend. The engine and drivetrain were simple, robust, and almost military grade. The flat-4 engine provided modest power, enough to carry supplies and passengers over rough terrain, but it was noisy, unrefined, and demanded frequent attention. Gear changes were mechanical and harsh, and every shift transmitted vibrations directly into the cabin. The brakes were primitive drum systems that required careful modulation, especially on wet or downhill surfaces. Suspension components were short and stiff, designed for off-road durability rather than comfort, and transmitted every bump directly into the occupants. Reliability was high in terms of survival, nothing would easily break, but everything about the ride reminded occupants that comfort was irrelevant to the Jeep's purpose. Long-distance driving was physically punishing. Drivers often emerged from trips fatigued, muscles sore, ears ringing from wind and engine noise, and bodies covered in bruises from jolts. The cabin, with its minimal sound insulation, metal floors, and exposed mechanical components, was constantly vibrating and rattling. Families quickly learned to treat trips as expeditions, not commutes. Despite the brutal ride, however, the CJ3B could conquer roads and paths that would stop most other vehicles entirely. It could ford streams, climb steep inclines, traverse mud and sand, and carry heavy loads without complaint. Its simplicity meant that it could be repaired in the field with basic tools, a trait that made it invaluable in rural areas or on off-road adventures where breakdowns in conventional cars would be catastrophic. Occupants had to adopt a defensive, highly attentive style of driving. Every bump, corner, or incline required precise coordination. Any misjudgment could lead to jarring shifts or loss of control. Testimonies from longtime owners often emphasize the constant need for focus. A driver could not relax even on straight, smooth roads. The Jeep demanded respect, teaching that safety and comfort were not part of its design equation. Its hazards were direct and immediate, yet they were balanced by the Jeep's extraordinary ability to survive terrain that would crush ordinary vehicles. The CJ3B was a vehicle of extremes. On highways, city streets, or suburban lanes, it was noisy, uncomfortable, and challenging, almost punishing its occupants with every mile. Off-road, it became a nearly unstoppable machine, capable of feats that seemed miraculous in their defiance of terrain and obstacles. It punished the weak, rewarded the skilled, and required constant awareness, endurance, and strength from those who attempted to master it. The dichotomy was stark: brutal discomfort and extreme danger on paved roads, unmatched capability and resilience on rugged terrain. Mechanically, it was as unforgiving as the terrain it was designed to conquer. Drum brakes, stiff leaf springs, and minimal shock absorption ensured that every surface irregularity was transmitted into the frame and seats. The short wheelbase exaggerated every movement, making bumps, turns, and emergency maneuvers tense and exhausting. Steering demanded constant attention, and even small mistakes could send the Jeep lurching unpredictably. Exhaust fumes, wind noise, and engine vibrations made the cabin feel alive with a wild energy that could either exhilarate or exhaust the occupants. It was a vehicle that would punish in comfort, but reward in capability, survival, and sheer mechanical honesty. The Willys Jeep CJ3B's legacy is one of paradoxes. It combined unmatched durability, field repairability, and off-road prowess with extreme discomfort, instability, and a raw, punishing driving experience. To modernize, it may appear quaint or even charming, but for those who experienced it firsthand, it was a constant exercise in endurance, attention, and respect. Every journey was a lesson in balance, preparation, and humility. In the end, the CJ3B is remembered not just as an early civilian Jeep, but as a machine that distilled the essence of a utilitarian, rugged, uncompromising vehicle, a vehicle that could survive almost anything, but demanded that its occupants survive it as well. Its story is not of convenience or luxury, but of a brutal, uncompromising mechanical honesty. Families, adventurers, and off-road enthusiasts learned quickly that comfort was optional, but survival and control were mandatory. It remains an enduring symbol of what happens when engineering prioritizes capability and durability above all else, a living lesson in respect for raw, unrefined machinery and the costs of uncompromising utility.
The Austin Champ, introduced in the early 1950s as Britain's answer to the ubiquitous military Jeep, was designed with ambition and technical sophistication in mind. The British Army envisioned a vehicle that could combine the off-road capability of the American Jeep with refined engineering, independent suspension, and advanced drivetrain features. On paper, the Champ looked revolutionary: fully independent suspension, a complex transfer case, advanced braking systems, and a luxurious, for a military vehicle, cockpit. But the reality of daily operation revealed a very different story. From the outset, the Champ proved temperamental. Its over-engineered design, meant to impress with complexity and capability, instead became a liability. The independent suspension system, unlike the simple leaf springs of a Jeep, was intricate and required constant adjustment. In muddy or uneven terrain, components would seize or misalign, leading to failures in steering and handling. The transmission and transfer case, with multiple gears and locking differentials, were prone to jamming if not meticulously maintained. Test drivers reported that the vehicle could become almost impossible to control if even minor mechanical issues arose, a scenario that left soldiers frustrated and anxious in the field. The weight of the Champ only compounded the problems. Unlike the lightweight Jeep, the Champ was heavy, making it slower on climbs, less nimble over obstacles, and more difficult to maneuver in tight spaces. When fully loaded with troops and equipment, the suspension sagged, brakes struggled, and the engine, though relatively powerful for its time, was taxed to its limits. Drivers described a constant battle to keep the vehicle moving efficiently, noting that the complexity meant fragility, and that what was designed to be sophisticated often felt dangerously delicate in real-world conditions. Maintenance became a nightmare. Every system, from the drivetrain to the electrical components, required specialized knowledge and tools that were not always available in field conditions. Parts failed frequently, and repairs could take hours or days, a severe liability during military operations. Mechanics recalled being constantly chasing faults that seemed to appear spontaneously, while soldiers grumbled that the vehicle, which should have been reliable and versatile, often broke down in the worst possible moments. Comparisons with the Jeep were inevitable, and in almost every case, the Champ lost. The Jeep's simplicity, robustness, and tolerance for abuse highlighted the Champ's fragility and impracticality. Beyond reliability, the Champ demanded respect to drive. The steering was heavy, brakes required careful modulation, and the complex gearboxes demanded skill and constant attention. Drivers reported a steep learning curve. One misstep, like selecting the wrong gear or misjudging the suspension limits, could leave the vehicle immobilized or dangerously unstable on rough terrain. Unlike the Jeep, which could be trusted in the hands of almost anyone, the Champ felt picky, high-strung, and unforgiving. Soldiers who attempted to drive it quickly learned that technical sophistication came with steep costs in usability and safety. The interior, while more refined than a Jeep, offered little comfort. Seats were minimalistic and firm, vibrations were transmitted harshly through the chassis, and noise levels were high due to exposed mechanical components. Long trips were fatiguing, and the vehicle's weight, combined with suspension limitations, made handling unpredictable on slopes, soft ground, or uneven surfaces. The Champ's combination of high weight, complex mechanics, and sensitive handling created a vehicle that was as mentally exhausting to operate as it was physically demanding. Ultimately, the Austin Champ became a cautionary tale in military vehicle design. Its ambition, advanced independent suspension, complex drive systems, and over-engineered mechanical solutions proved to be its downfall. Where the Jeep thrived on simplicity, durability, and field reliability, the Champ stumbled under the weight of its own sophistication. By the late 1950s, the British Army largely replaced it with simpler, more robust vehicles, acknowledging that complexity and refinement could not compensate for fragility in harsh operational environments. The legacy of the Austin Champ is a paradox. It was praised for its engineering ingenuity and capability on paper, yet cursed in practice for its temperamental behavior and impracticality. Enthusiasts today may admire its ambition and rarity, but anyone who worked with or drove the vehicle at the time recalls it as a frustrating, delicate machine that required constant care, attention, and respect. In the end, the Champ stands as a reminder that over-engineering, without consideration for reliability and simplicity, can turn even the most sophisticated vehicle into a liability. A military SUV that was clever in concept, but frustrating, fragile, and impractical in reality.
The International Harvester Scout's early prototypes, developed in the late 1950s, were some of the most grueling and instructive vehicles in the history of American off-road design. Before the Scout became the compact SUV icon of the 1960s, engineers were essentially building an entirely new vehicle class from scratch, one that promised the ruggedness of a Jeep, but aimed to be slightly more refined, versatile, and civilian-friendly. Yet, in its raw, untested form, the Scout prototypes were harsh, unforgiving, and in many ways hazardous, offering a glimpse into the brutal realities of vehicle development before modern safety standards existed. From the moment a driver climbed into the prototype, it was clear the Scout was a vehicle that demanded constant attention. The cockpit was cramped, with thick roof pillars that blocked peripheral vision, tiny windows, and a flat metal dashboard that offered little in the way of ergonomics. Drivers reported that simply navigating narrow trails required immense concentration. On rough terrain, the Scout's suspension, still in a primitive design stage, would flex unpredictably. Leaf springs and early shock absorbers absorbed uneven terrain poorly. The chassis could twist visibly under stress, and mounting points for suspension components often creaked or even fractured during aggressive off-road maneuvers. Test drivers reported hearing ominous pops and groans as the frame worked beyond its early tolerances. The steering was another source of relentless fatigue. Without the benefit of power assist, the Scout required tremendous physical effort to guide over rocky paths, soft dirt, and even slight inclines.
The rudimentary geometry amplified tiny road imperfections, causing the front wheels to wander and the vehicle to lurch unexpectedly. On paved surfaces, it was almost as unnerving. Sudden bumps could induce twitchy, overcorrected steering, forcing drivers to constantly wrestle the wheel to keep the Scout in a straight line. These characteristics, combined with a high center of gravity and narrow track width, meant that even small errors could potentially tip the vehicle. In controlled testing, a few prototypes nearly rolled when drivers attempted rapid maneuvers or steep hill climbs. Braking systems in the Scout prototypes were rudimentary and often dangerous. The trucks used drum brakes with limited cooling, which meant that repeated braking on descents could produce fade, dramatically increasing stopping distances. Engineers recorded several instances where the truck barely slowed under heavy load, requiring extreme care to prevent collisions or loss of control. Combined with unpredictable suspension behavior and twitchy steering, braking became a critical source of near misses during early tests. The drivetrain and engine performance exacerbated the challenges. Early Scouts were equipped with engines that delivered uneven torque, particularly under load. The clutch and transmission were stiff and imprecise, with shifts that could upset the vehicle's balance on inclines or rough terrain. Test drivers recounted scenarios where a sudden torque surge caused the rear wheels to spin out on loose dirt, shifting weight unpredictably and forcing split-second corrections. In extreme cases, this imbalance could lift a wheel or pitch the truck off an edge, an alarming experience for any driver. Cabin comfort, or the lack thereof, added to the ordeal. Seats were thin, mounted on bare metal frames, and offered almost no cushioning for long drives over rough terrain. The cabin itself resonated like a drum, amplifying every bump, rock, and vibration. Drivers frequently reported aching backs, numb hands, and fatigue that set in within minutes of off-road testing. Noise, heat, and dust infiltrated the cabin constantly, leaving testers physically and mentally exhausted by the end of a typical day. Engineers quickly realized that these prototypes were teaching painful lessons in the limits of vehicle design. Structural reinforcements, suspension redesigns, braking upgrades, and steering geometry adjustments became daily topics of debate. Every test run revealed new failures: cracked suspension mounts, misaligned steering linkages, flexing frame members, and components that fatigued faster than expected. Even minor design flaws could turn into major hazards, creating a prototype that was almost as dangerous as it was innovative. Despite these dangers, the early Scout prototypes were invaluable. They allowed International Harvester to identify weaknesses before mass production, guiding improvements that would eventually lead to the rugged, reliable Scout of the 1960s. Yet for those who drove the original machines, they were exercises of endurance, nerve, and near-constant risk. Drivers often likened the experience to wrestling a stubborn mule over a rocky field while blindfolded, a testament to the vehicle's raw and unrefined character. Ultimately, the late 1950s Scout prototypes are remembered not for their comfort or usability, but for the brutal lessons they imparted about off-road engineering, structural integrity, and human factors in vehicle design. They were the crucible in which the Scout's identity was forged, a machine that demanded respect, rewarded skill, and forced engineers to confront every challenge head-on. For collectors and historians today, these prototypes are almost mythical, not merely because of their rarity, but because of the peril, ingenuity, and relentless testing that defined their short, intense existence. Would you like me to expand this further into a full chapter-length narrative covering multiple prototype iterations, individual test runs, and detailed accounts of every failure and near accident?